Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Friends of the Royal Alberta Museum Society and the Edmonton Heritage Council, we would like to thank you for joining us this evening for Dr. Adriana Davies' presentation of her new book, From Sojourners to Citizens, Alberta's Italian History. My name is Ravi, board member and president of Friends of Royal Alberta Museum Society, FRAMS for short. For those of you not aware of our society, we are a registered charity and an independent membership-driven not-for-profit organization that promotes and supports the Royal Alberta Museum, one of Canada's leading heritage institutions. Since 1982, FRAMS has been a leading pathway for Albertans to enrich the Royal Alberta Museum's collections and providing inclusive, diverse, and accessible opportunities for learning, exploring, and participating in civic dialogue. Joining me this evening as our moderator is David Ridley, Executive Director of the Edmonton Heritage Council. On behalf of FRAMS, I would like to extend our gratitude and appreciation to the Edmonton Heritage Council partnering with us to co-host this evening's event. Before we begin, we would like to recognize that we are webcasting from and to many parts of Alberta today, and in fact, across the country. The province of Alberta is located on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory, and is traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples. FRAMS and the Edmonton Heritage Council respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional and ancestral gathering place for diverse and Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived and cared for these lands for generations. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Acknowledging traditional territories is one part of recognizing and moving beyond colonization and strengthening our relationships. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. We have a few small housekeeping items to mention before we start. Along the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat button and a Q&A button. If you have any technical issues, please reach out to FRAMS in the chat window. You can also make use of the chat window to make general comments or have discussions. We will be having a Q&A session. David will be providing more detail on the entire Q&A process in a few minutes. Closed captioning is available. There's an option to activate it along the bottom menu bar. Just to let you know, we will be recording today's session, and in a few days' time, a link to view the recording will be available on the FRAMS website. And that is it for housekeeping. I'd like to mention that we do have a special guest joining us this evening who would like to say a few words. We are pleased to welcome the Consul General of Italy in Vancouver, His Excellency, Mr. Fabio Messineo. Excellency, I'll suggest that we come back to you. We'll move on and come back to you before we end this session. So you can say your few words. So at this juncture, I'd like to turn it over to David Ridley.
Thank you so much, Rav, for that introduction. And we'll see if we can resolve the matter with His Excellency to take care of that. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and thank you for joining this evening. It's a really exciting evening for us in terms of the organizations who are involved in this. I want to thank the Friends of the Royal Alberta Museum Society for their sort of generous involvement in this. And then we also have organizations like the Edmonton District Historical Society members, and then special appreciation to those who are joining from outside the Edmonton region. That's wonderful. I've seen know some people from Kapuskasing, Ontario, Kelowna, BC, and I'm sure many others. And if you wish, in the chat feature, I wanted to just note your place of residence, or perhaps if you have a connection to one of the communities where Italian immigration and the Italian culture has been historically or is alive and well, that's always welcome as well. Before I introduce Adriana and we get moving on this, I'll just talk a little bit about the approach to this. So we welcome questions throughout the session, although we'll take those as we can. And you can best put those in the Q&A, the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. So not in the chat, but the Q&A. That just helps some of the sorting that goes on. So that's much appreciated. And the way we'll proceed this evening, this is about the book and about the writer and author and the community. So we want to be able to really explore, take you on a journey on that. We're hoping some of you might have a copy of the book already, but if you don't, I know Joe and some of the people working in the backgrounds tonight have provided a link to Guernica Editions for the purchase of the book. We also need to recognize the publisher in this work and their great efforts to bring this work forward. And Guernica Editions does wonderful work really in the broader Italian community and in literature and history and social comment. So we're very thankful for that. So unlike a usual virtual book launch, you can't pick up a copy, but I'll just show for your sake, there's the book. It's lovely. It's a lovely format, great for photographs. So really encourage you to pick up copies for yourself, friends, and families. I just wanted a quick note. The Edmonton Heritage Council, just a quick note, our mission is, as a charitable not-for-profit organization, is to connect people, and by that we mainly mean Edmontonians, with the stories of our city, of Edmonton. And we do that through support, leadership, funding to help Edmontonians research, preserve, interpret, and advocate for their heritage. But as the capital city of Alberta, we're delighted to be able to put on the capital city pants, I guess you could say, and support this kind of work that really has reach, not just around in Alberta and the communities that are there, but beyond and throughout the country. So we're really excited about that. Adriana, who I'll introduce momentarily, she is the first recipient of the Heritage Writers Reserve Award, and that's to provide Edmonton writers, researchers, and historians with funding to advance the publication and the dissemination of book projects that explore aspects of Edmonton's history and heritage. But as I said, delighted in this case that it's not limited to that, and that's a wonderful wonderful element of what we're working on here tonight. Tonight's discussion or conversation will really be divided in sort of three segments where I'll be having a conversation with Adriana. We'll have some images to provide, and we'll move along. We'll be finished in time, or even before perhaps the scheduled time. We know all of us, or many of you, are spending a lot of time in virtual platforms, so we want to be conscious of our endurance in that regard. Let's leave that. So we'll get ready to move along on this. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Adriana Alby Davies. She is a wonderful presence and has been a wonderful presence over years in the heritage and historical community and the cultural community in Edmonton and Alberta and in the country. For more than 40 years, she's worked as a researcher, writer, and editor, lecturer, executive director, and curator in Canada and in England. She has her PhD from the University of London, England, of course. Some of her early work after her graduate work was as a science and technology editor of the Canadian Encyclopedia. That's a remarkable work, and one that Adriana's hand in that work was exceptional. And from 1983 to 1989, she served as executive director of the Alberta Museums Society. And it was really a period of remarkable growth for that organization and development. And it really put the Alberta Museums Association at the forefront of provincial museums association in the country. And that is due to no small part to Adriana's energy and vision. After that, she spent the following decade as the Heritage Community Foundation's executive director, as well as editor-in-chief of the Alberta Online Encyclopedia. and where she documented and presented Alberta's rich public, economic, and social history, largely on websites, both for formal and informal learning. And by 2009, the 84 websites that had been excellent websites that had been created were gifted to the University of Alberta. And I know sometime tonight you'll have a chance to connect that. Maybe before I finish the introduction, I hear His Excellency, Mr. Messineo, is ready to jump in. So let's do that, and then I'll come back and I'll finish the introduction and then we'll move along. So, Your Excellency, thank you. It'll be good to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very sorry for the problem before. Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to attend this book launch that allows me to be virtually in Edmonton, that is part of my jurisdiction as Consul General Italy in Western Canada. At first, I would like to thank the Friends of the Royal Alberta Museum Society and the Edmonton Heritage Council for the organization of this event, and to congratulate Dr. Adriana Davies for her new book about the untold history of the Italian citizen in Alberta. Dr. Davies has spent 40 years documenting Alberta's Italian communities and has been a part of many important projects that captured the story of early Italian Canadians in Alberta. Her contribution towards the preservation of Italian language and culture, and her research and publication on Italian immigration was officially recognized in 2015 when she received the title of Cavaliere d'Italia, Knighthood of Italy, a prestigious award delivered by the President of the Italian Republic to people who have honored Italy in the world. It's truly important to maintain and transmit to the next generation the countless stories of Italian families who arrived in Alberta many decades ago and contribute to the development of the province, and nowadays testifies the multiple ties between Canada and Italy. Enjoy the talk, and warm greetings from Vancouver. Arrivederci.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Wonderful to have you with us this evening and to bring that greeting. So let's get to Adriana, but a quick finish. And Adriana, believe me, as an acquaintance and friend and colleague over the years, I'm cutting a lot of stuff out, even though that was a lengthy introduction. But Adriana was invested in the Order of Canada in 2010 for her contributions to heritage and history in Canada. And in 2015, she was awarded the Cavaliere d'Italia, a knighthood by the government of Italy, for her contributions to the preservation of the Italian language and culture, and her research and publications on Italian immigration to Canada. The book that we're speaking about tonight and this work is only one of Adriana's several publications. And recently, The Rise and Fall of Emilia Piccarello, which also was part of a very significant and important exhibit in Alberta and BC, in some of the museums in the provinces, and her anthology, co-editor with Jeff Keshen from the University of Calgary, The Frontier of Patriotism, Alberta in the First World War, 2016. So, Adriana, delighted to be here with you tonight. Thank you for this wonderful work. It's quite a piece. It's marvelous.
Well, David, thank you. And I'd like to begin, by acknowledging the support that I've received from a range of organizations with respect to the research and the writing of this book. I received grants from the Alberta Historical Resources Division of Alberta Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women. Also the National Congress of Italian Canadians, Edmonton District, the Santa Maria Goretti Community Center, and most recently, of course, the wonderful inaugural Heritage Writers Reserve Award from the Edmonton Heritage Council. I also want to thank Michael Mirola, the editor-in-chief of Guernica Editions, and his staff for their support. I'm delighted with the book, and it couldn't have happened without all of you. It is a labor of love. You know, when I came back from England after completing my PhD, I received a call from Father Gustav Echa, the pastor at Santa Maria Goretti Parish. He wanted to do something to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the parish in 1983. And so he had created a historical society, the Italian Settled in Edmonton Historical Society, but he felt he needed an editor and a writer. And so the next thing I knew, I was not only researching and writing a commemorative booklet, but I was involved in planning an oral history project. And there's a linkage with the Royal Alberta Museum, which was then the Provincial Museum of Alberta, because we went for advice to David Goa, the curator of folk and religious life, and also Jim Parker, the first archivist at the University of Alberta, that helped us to shape that project. And I was also mentored by Dr. Rudy Beckley from the US, a leading Italian American historian. So that really set me on this course, you know, which is over 40 years.
A remarkable set of teachers, and that's something you really touch on eloquently in the introduction of the book. Now, the book is an introduction, and there are 10 chapters. That's a lot to ramble through in the short time we have. It's clear it's obviously been a journey of intellect and love and community to get there. So what we want to do is sort of talk about the book in different segments. So, you know, the first chapters are working on the railways, when coal was king, settling the land, and a chapter called Shopkeepers, Tradesmen, and Entrepreneurs. So what should we understand about the particular experience and the factors in Italian immigration to North America, but also in Alberta specifically, and the experience of arrival and settlement and the community finding its way as sojourners at first, as in the title of the book?
Well, you know, I'm going to call a spade and say that immigration history is really about racism, or at least that's a part of it, of the story. That there were people who were considered potential ideal settlers and others less so. Sadly, Italians were considered less desirable. And, you know, an important book, which was published in 1909 by the Missionary Society of the Methodist Church of Canada. It was written by J.S. Wordsworth, who was superintendent of the All Peoples Mission in Winnipeg. And he was tending to a lot of immigrants. I mean, he had in Toronto, and he did in Winnipeg, because as the railways moved west, really Winnipeg became the railhead, and it had a large Italian community of men who worked on the railways as temporary workers. Now, his book, Strangers Within Our Gates, the chapters can be viewed as a kind of ranking of desirable immigrants. So at the top is Great Britain, then United States, including the Mormons, and of course they came to Alberta, Scandinavians, including Icelanders, Germans, including the Mennonites, French, Southeastern Europe, including Russians, Doukhobors, Lithuanians, Austria-Hungary, including Bohemians, Slovaks, Ruthenians, Poles, Hungarians, Balkan states, Hebrews, Italians, North and South, Levantine races, including Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Syrians, Persians, Orientals, including Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, and Negro and Indian. So you can see that, you know, from the get-go, it not only Italian immigrants, but all of those others in the bottom part of that ladder experienced discrimination, both in the workplace and in the community. And the tone of that book was fear-mongering. The prefatory section is titled Immigration, a World Problem. And it describes a vast and endless army marching from northern, eastern, and southern Europe at the rate of 1.5 million per year towards the civilized world. And he described it as an invading army. I will now give you some background on the Italian stats. From the period 1861 to 1914, over 14 million Italians, mostly men, left to work abroad. I mean, and this was an immigration of poverty and great misery. In 1861, Italy had been unified, and the Habsburgs and the French, I mean, no longer governed Italy, but I mean, Italy economically was a basket case, and the Italian inheritance system, which unlike the British, which involves primogeniture, that the estate goes directly to one individual. In Italy, the land is parceled out. So you have these large, poor families, and you had lots of children because they were potential workers living in these tiny, tiny little plots. So the immigration was extremely high, the rate of immigration, and that they went because they wanted to make money and send it back home, to help the family. I mean, that was initially that they were sojourners. That was what the intention was, and that, the notion that the streets were paved with gold. A lot of them went through Ellis Island. And I mean, those labor chains, the Italians worked in various parts of the United States, railway building and construction, mining, moving westward, then up into the Pacific Northwest, and then to BC and Alberta.
The United States was the more desirable.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And when they began to reduce the numbers that were allowed, then Canada became extremely important. But many of them just came to the United States and then work on the railways, because of course we know that the CPR had promised to unify Eastern Canada and British Columbia. And so that railway had to be built through the West. And Italians are part of the navvies who worked upon the railway. And I mean, a lot of them, set the dynamite charges so that, they really risked life and limb. And we have some accounts of that because, I mean, they were itinerant. I mean, nobody was, other than the statistics and, the names of casualties, which I found, we didn't know who these people were. But there was an oblate priest, Father Goccola, who was sent. He was from Sardinia, but spoke Italian, and he was sent to the St. Mary's Mission near Kamloops. And Father Lacombe asked him to tend to the spiritual needs of Italian immigrants who were working on the railways. And so he writes about that. And, the disease, the accidents, the landslides. I mean, it was terribly, terribly dangerous work.
One of the things, just on that, Adriana, in the book, people should know, is that there's an extensive bibliography. And I don't know whether the work that you've referenced, I was thinking, was one of the, I heard one comment is, we may want to work in this in the future, an index to pull that work, forward in the book, but that's a lot of extra work at this point, and we're not going to do it. But it's just the sources you've drawn on for the book, including the one you've just referenced from the Oblate Father, a testament to the remarkable research and the reach of the work you've done. At what point, now we have some images. I'm wondering, would this be a good time to pull those up? So we'll ask Jessica to do that just in this segment. And you've touched on the work and building the railways. One of the things I thought we might focus on, because it really does start to establish the, and is on the thinking about the coal mining. Maybe we could just pop back to the initial images there again. Pardon me, Jessica. Thanks. And then that's great. And Adriana, if you wanted to give any commentary as we move through these, and that'd be great. Thank you.
You know, even though Italians were less desirable, you can see that the government did view them as desirable workers. And Mr. Shaughnessy of the CPR basically said, look, we don't want to hire Brits because they'll want hot and cold running water and you know, a feather bed. You know, we want Italians, you know, who are going to work hard, and you know, they'll work all of the hours God gives, and they'll do good work. So I mean, they you know, they were targeted as desirable employees. And there were a number of labor agents based in Montreal, Cardasco being one of them, and he was from southern Italy, Calabria, my own province, who brought over a lot of laborers to work for the CPR. And of course, these books and fairs were held in various countries. And some Italians, of course, saw these publications and those trade fairs and were attracted to farming in the West. Fewer homesteaded, about 200 families. There was a settlement, an unofficial settlement in Naples. And then, of course, there was the Italian-sponsored colony that was set up in the Lac La Biche area of northern Alberta in 1914, 1915. And the Scrivano family, Sam was sponsored by his sister and her husband, who lived in the Rossdale Flats and operated a Venice grocery. There were Venice groceries all over the country. And so that's on one of their trips to and from Italy.
I'm looking at this image and going, you know, I'm in the offices of the Edmonton Heritage Council, which is in the Prince of Wales Armories Heritage Center here in Edmonton. I'm just a few blocks from where this photograph would have been taken, really, and the neighborhood, which was the landing place for generations of new Edmontonians, and including the Italian community.
Sam worked for CNR to the end of his life, because I mean, once the main lines and the branch lines were constructed, they still needed men to do maintenance. And the Veltri brothers, Giovanni and Vincenzo, who changed their names to Welch, did a lot of maintenance. And the family, the son, Ralph Welch, brought in Italians in the late 1940s and 50s to work on CNR gangs. And so that's a lot of immigrants came and worked for those gangs before settling in Edmonton and Calgary and other areas.
That's great. Adriana, just a question from Shan, who's one of the guests here. Any sense, like, what were the financial constraints of coming from Italy? How much did it cost to come from Italy in the early 1900s, and how were those trips financed? How would it, what would it require to save and pay versus their income? Like, how was that done?
That's a very good point. Those who had family to sponsor them, that was relatively easy. But for the rest, it would be the agent who could represent a steamship company. The city of Chiasso in southern Switzerland on the Swiss-Italian border was where many steamship companies had offices, including the CPR. And that then one of those labor agents would cover the cost of the trip, meals, all of that, but then claw that money back from your wage. So that it was relatively, I mean, unlike the Chinese, that there was no head tax. So, but that, you know, you owned your soul to the company store. I mean, literally. I mean, the labor agent who brought you in, you had to pay him back. And also, of course, if you worked in the mines, you also had to shop in the company store as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And just another related question, upon arrival and immigration, you say anything about the alteration of names of that? Because, you know, that's a broad story through many communities arriving, Eastern European and so on. It's very significant and, you know, is to this day.
Absolutely, it applies to Italians. The names were written down wrong. And of course, one of my sources, you know, which wasn't available 15, 20 years ago, of course, is ancestry.ca and other sites like that. And, you know, which provide access to census records and a whole range of other materials.
That's great.
So, you know, my editor, Michael, said, look, why can't we correct these names? I said, no, I said, they're legal. I mean, Giuseppe, which is in the Italian spelled Giuseppe, is frequently spelled GUI. And I mean, so yes, that was incredibly common.
Let's go to the next image and really into the coal era, really the community and the relationship with coal mining. So we've got a few images here, but maybe you can just lay out in fairly you know, brief terms the relationship from early arrival and labor into the coal mining industry in the province and in the Northwest.
From the Kootenays, Fernie, to Drumheller, you had mines. There were over 200 mines in Edmonton. I mean, it was different kinds of coal. The best coal, of course, was in the Rockies. And Alberta had 85% of the coal deposits of Canada and 18% of the coal deposits of the world. So it was a huge industry. By 1906, the workforce totaled 2,800, 8,000 by 1914, 12,500 by 1924. In the 1920s, the value of the annual output was 30 million, with over 14 million paid out in wages. So if you could get a job in the mines, whether you liked mining or not, you were really secure. So you would have 3 to 5 generations of a family working in the mines, and that you had less social mobility as a result of that than was experienced in agricultural communities and urban communities. Because, you know, although there were strikes, and of course there were disasters like the Hillcrest mine disaster, where 189 people were killed, I believe.
Can we go to the next image there, Jessica? Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, there you see. I mean, they ran out of coffins, and so they created these newly sawn wood boxes, and they were buried in trenches. It's horrendous, and you can see in the cemetery the markers for the graves.
Yep. We go to the next image. Thanks, Jessica.
And you know, it's very rare to have an Italian-owned mine, but the Legal coal mine was started by the Chiarellos, father and son, and it had no workings. I mean, a prairie mine, the coal is very close to the surface. Carry on.
This is the Edmonton region here as well. It should be noted, sort of shifted there from the Crow's Nest Pass in the south to the Edmonton region, and now we're back down to Canmore.
Yeah, Canmore, of course, was incredibly important. They supplied coal to the CPR as well as others. Now, the Masoli family, fascinating, and you get this, and I think of Verdi, the Italian village band. Well, they brought music to these coal mines as well, and Italians played in the colliery bands and the elk bands and so on. So I thought this was a lovely image.
Yes. And Brûlé, yeah, so west of Edmonton.
Yeah, of course, you had mines developed along the eastern slopes of the Rockies, where currently, of course, the province wanted to see, coal mining renewed, but of course, there's environmental protests around this, so that you had the community Nordegg, Mountain Park, all the coal branch. And then you also had mines up in Jasper at Pocahontas. So there were Italians in all of those communities.
Great. We'll go to the next image here, see where we're at. Oh, Nordegg, there we go.
Yeah. And to give you an idea of the population, in about 1912, in the Crow's Nest communities, probably there were about 400 Italians working in the mines. So the population there was larger than it was in Edmonton or Calgary. So it was a big industry.
Good.
And Italians were very active in unions. They were strong supporters of not only the United Mine Workers of America, but also the one big union, the attempt, which was particularly popular in Alberta, to get rid of the different crafts, the segmentation into different trades, and to have one big union, which would have given them, they felt, more power. But it didn't work out. But Italians marched. There were hunger marches in the 30s in Calgary, for example, Drumheller. And of course, they celebrated May Day, which was, of course, the workers' day. And so they were very active. And because the mining companies provided very few benefits, in 1906, in the Lille mines in the Crow's Nest Pass, you had the formation of the Ordine Indipendente Figli d'Italia, the independent order of the Sons of Italy. That by 1921, they rejected the American parent organizations and changed their name. And the fraternal groups throughout the Crow's Nest Pass into Drumheller affiliated under Fernie, which is where the mother chapter was, and they renamed themselves the Flower of Italy.
Right. That's great. Let's see, let's go to the next slide and we'll just see where we're at, and then back in Drumheller as well. Yeah.
This is a huge achievement. The Stocco family and partners started buying out mines in the Drumheller area where they were almost mined out. And this was one of their biggest endeavors. The brilliant mine in Drumheller. And Tegla Klotza, who married, Tegla married another a miner. In the hills of Drumheller, wrote some wonderful accounts, and I cite her in the book. Her mother was a midwife, had an extensive garden, they made wine, all of those things,
That's great. Adriana, just a quick, there's some questions coming in and I want to get to these, but one of the questions germane to this is, in that era, this is a question from Joanne, noting that in the images, some of the workers are quite young. What were the, I was going to say labor laws, perhaps knowing that those that may not be the correct term, but age limits for working in the coal mines. Do you have a sense of that, how that played out in the community, and I guess more broadly in other communities?
That's a great question. I mean, a 12-year-old or 14-year-old boy could be not, on the coal face, but at the tip hole, picking lumps of coal. I mean, so I would say that probably 16. I mean, you could start working in the mine, but younger children did work in associated work.
Great. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, we're just going to hold there for a minute. So Adriana, we've kind of skipped over the matter of land settlement and agriculture. I mean, in the West, of course, so often the idea of homesteading is there. So there's a couple of questions, one from Earl and one from Marina, if I have that correct. Pardon me if I don't. So, it's a similar period when Eastern European immigration, Ukrainian, Galician, Ruthenians were coming, and there were certainly apparently fewer Italians homesteaded. So that's the question Earl's asking, why that was the case. And then I'm just going to add the second question on. You do talk in your book about the relations of Italians with Indigenous communities and other communities such as the Ruthenians and Galicians, Ukrainians, and others. So Marina was just wanting to hear a little bit more about that. So really the question of homesteading in the community, and then relationships with other immigrant and Indigenous communities.
My theory is that agriculture on the prairies is so different from Italy, where you basically had a small mixed farm. I mean, you had animals, you had vineyards and fruit trees and vegetable gardens and so on. So I think that it was the nature of prairie agriculture. What was interesting is that you did have in the Lethbridge area, where you had arable land as well as mines, you'd have the father and sons working in the coal mine and the mother and daughters looking after, the land holding. So, but in that area, they moved into dairying. And so you had some major dairy operations. In terms of the Naples settlement, they mostly came through the US, and they had been working, on the railways and in construction. But then they saw one of the fairs, say, "Go west, young man," and, grain growing and all of this. And so that they settled there, and probably about 30. But the biggest agricultural settlement was in the Venice Hilo area near Lac La Biche, and they were mostly Northern Italians, and they succeeded O.J. Biolo, who was one of the colonists, managed to get the post office named Venice. They wanted the other post office named Trieste because there was a large group from Trieste. But the railway company decided that the other post office would be named Hilo, and it was a board game of some kind.
All right. And then any comment just on relations, other relationships with communities and the Indigenous community?
Well, it's interesting. In Northern Alberta, certainly there were some relationships, Lac La Biche. I mean, they went to schools run by nuns and priests, so they learned French. So certainly there were close relationships with the French. In terms of the two cowboys, in Southern Alberta, they had very close ties with the Indigenous people. So it varied.
You're talking about George
Ocatera and Roberto Basilici, yeah. So yes, I mean there were and in terms of the whole Amber Valley settlement and that area, Italians worked on various gangs with Black settlers in that area. So yes, and I think in the mines, I mean, you know, when you're at the bottom of the pecking order, you tend to, you know, commiserate and associate with each other, right?
So it is. Great, we'll keep moving. Actually, there's one more quick question. It just goes back to the naming. It's from Peggy again. Around naming, you're talking about the alteration of names, but were changes made to names by people in the community to sound more, you know, to sound Anglo or to resonate with the dominant society?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Very few Italians in Alberta changed their names, but there are two very prominent families in the Delia area that changed their names. And I mean, they also intermarried very early. So so they assimilated very quickly, served on school boards and councils and so on. So, but on the other hand, I mean, they still spoke broken English. So, you know, I don't know whether the name helped or it's just they were a very entrepreneurial family. They purchased agricultural equipment, so they were able to do the harvest for the whole region. You know, so relatively few though changed their names.
Great. All right, we're going to move on now. There's some images. I suggest we move through these pretty quickly because we really want to move into the next section. And I should say, I didn't say at the beginning, sorry, we haven't really planned any, you know, break interludes. We know we've been, most of us have been doing these online presentations. You know, we can get up and take a break and walk around and do what you need to. So we're just going to keep plowing ahead, as long as you're okay with that, Adriana.
I am. I just
Okay.
want to comment on the couple of pictures before.
Okay, we can go back. Yeah.
I mean, there's the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore. Emilio Picariello purchased that around 1918. And of course, that became the headquarters of his bootlegging operations. And of course, the tragedy, the killing of the Alberta Provincial Police officer, Dawson, Constable Dawson, and of course, Emilio Picariello, and his best friend's wife, Florence Lysandro, were found guilty and executed. My book proves their innocence, but he was an enormous entrepreneur. With respect to the next slide, Angelo Topano, he was in the Crow's Nest Pass. I mean, he set up the small grocery store that he ran for years and years. And of course, that took business away from the mining company stores. The next slide, of course, the People's Bakery in Drumheller, an enormously successful family. They even have little tokens that you could trade in for bread, but you can see the signage. I mean, they were very good marketers. And Enrico Pozzi, if you go to Blairmore and other Crow's Nest communities, the impressive buildings, most of which are designated by as Alberta Provincial Historic Resources, were built by him. So he was a major contractor and builder in the Crow's Nest Pass.
As we're moving through these, Adriana, just you know, one knows the significance of Italian craftsmen, and I don't know whether those are immigrants or whether some were craftsmen who returned on the construction of the Alberta legislature.
Yes, there were. I mean, and you've got the terrazzo floors. And so basically there were some brought in from Chicago and some from New York. And of course, some stayed, and they lived in the Rossdale flats. Yeah.
Here in Edmonton, yeah.
Yeah.
Next
and
image.
Large construction companies, also the Kaleli Construction, started around 1910, 1911 in Calgary and continued by the Sons. You know, it still exists in a variety of forms. And in terms of Edmonton, of course, it's New West construction, and it was cousins, Felix Nigro and Jimmy Anselmo. The Welch brothers were their uncles, and they started working for them. Then created a major, between the Galelis and the New West construction, they probably constructed about 2/3 of the highways and roads in bridges in the province.
Great.
And of
Next.
course, Louis Beaumonti. I mean, you know, the barber shop, which still exists, of course, in Little Italy, in Edmonton. He owned a number of barber shops, and his family started by working in the mines, but he hated it. Music was his great love. And eventually he became a barber and then had various bands. So that's Venice Barbershop.
Sounds like he should be in the new Alberta Social Studies curriculum, but I'll leave that one alone. If he's not related to the premier, sorry. The next image, please. Oh, okay. So we're going to change gears here. So that's fine. There was one more question from Eleanor that I wanted to. Were there any, like one presumes that the immigrants were largely, you know, Roman Catholic, but were there any minorities among immigrants who came to Alberta, Jewish, Protestant? What's the, any evidence of that or insight into that?
Well, I would say that most were Catholics, whether they practiced or not is another matter. I mean, I think Father Golcola would hold mass at 6 a.m, you know, and he moved from camp to camp, you know, wherever, you know, the railways were being built. And so that he would say mass. He would also write letters home for them. But in terms of then the parishes where they worshipped, the earliest Italian parish in Alberta was in Venice, Venice Hilo settlement, the Holy Redeemer parish, built in 1926, and a priest came from Italy. And in terms of Edmonton, that didn't happen until 1958. And in terms of Calgary, it was the 1960s. Right. But they tended to, in Edmonton, they worshipped at St. Joachim, the French parish. And you know, and then of course, when they settled in what became Little Italy, because it was close to, well, the inner city Boyle-Macaulay neighborhoods, which were close to Immigration Hall, they then worshipped in churches in that area, English language churches. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's go to the next section, and so chapter 6 of your book is one of the longer chapters in terms of page length, because it really touches on a broad history that, you know, connects with the early immigration period, the First War, the interwar period, and the Second War. And it's on the experience of the community in that period. And, you know, we were discussing earlier today, Adriana, you know, in the 20s, the period of vigorous nationalism and related social and political movements in Italy, but also in most other European countries. And so the title of the chapter is Enemy, Alien, Designation, and Internment. We can, I mean, you can speak to that. I know we have a few slides that might be just as easy to speak through those. Would that be useful to pull it up? Let's pull the images up on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do this, and then there's a few more questions coming in, so we'll attend to those as we as we can. Yeah, so maybe we can go to the next, to the first slide there, and you can speak to this. So,
Well, when Mussolini came to power, he immediately thought of the Italian colonies abroad. And so he sent Italia Garibaldi, the granddaughter of Giuseppe Garibaldi, and various other members of her family, international speaking circuit. But she was sent specifically by Mussolini and had meetings in Ottawa with the Minister of Agriculture, because the intention was to bring Italians from Northern Italy to set up further agricultural colonies in the West. And so she arrived in November of 1922, and she was in Alberta in early January of 1923. And she visited Edmonton, Calgary, and Venice. And of course, she was lionized by the media, both in Edmonton and in Calgary. Let's go to the next slide. And as a result of her visit, fascist cells were set up in Venice, in Edmonton, Calgary, and Lethbridge. And in November of 1926, a provincial fascio was set up in Calgary. And the gentleman pictured is Felice De Angelis, who was the Italian consular agent, a civil engineer, who set up the agricultural colonies at Venice and Hilo. Next. And of course, one of the leaders of the fascist movement was Antonio Rebaldengo, who came from Northern Italy. He was a young man when Mussolini came to power and was totally captivated by him, as were world leaders. And he was instrumental in setting up the fascio in Calgary and in Venice, and served as the secretary. And of course, in terms of the road to the Second World War, the RCMP began to take an interest in German and Italian communities and communists in various communities as early as 1931. And in reading some of the literature, because most of the writing that has been done is about the internees in Ontario and Quebec. Over 600 Italians were interned, and the majority were from those regions, the most populous. I think BC had around 70. There were 6 from Alberta. But the RCMP was taking an interest. And one of the Italian-Canadian academic historians who were looking at enemy alien designation and internment found a reference to an LT in Banff, who this is in 1931 in RCMP records, this LT in Banff, who was the manager of the Cascade Hotel. Well, of course, because I know this stuff cold. I've read all the family histories. I've listened to oral histories. I've seen all of this archival material. I realized that LT was Louis Trono, a coal mining family. His parents and uncles, his father and uncles worked in Bankhead, and then when the mine closed there, they worked in other mines. But Louis did work as a busboy in several hotels in Banff, but also was a terrific musician. And so he was 18 when in 1926, when the provincial fascia was established. So he was not the manager of the Cascade Hotel, but they report him because he received fascia membership cards from Italy and was distributing them. And of course, who told the RCMP? Other Italians, because in 1926, with the formation of the fascio, there was a debate in the pages of the Calgary Herald where you had the miners' societies who were opposing the setting up of the fascio. So this was aired, and this division within the Italian community made it into the Calgary Herald. So, I mean, what happened then with Canada declaring war on Italy after Italy declared war on the UK was that anyone who was naturalized after September 1st, 1922 was designated as an enemy alien. And then those with close ties with the fasci then were interned.
Right.
And of course, all of the Italian societies died. People denied knowing the Italian language. With the massive wave of immigration beginning in 1950, say, you know, those Italians who had come before denied knowing Italian. I mean, so that it was really a wound for the community to be designated as enemy aliens, have to report to the RCMP. Many of them bought war bonds, you know, to show their support for the Canadian war effort. And of course, a lot of Italian Canadians did serve in the military and
Absolutely.
were killed. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just, you know, we're noting that, and then there's been a history to the matter of any, you know, redress and concern around this, including the prospect of this month, I believe, Prime Minister Trudeau, they may be working on an apology, but this goes back now 30 years in terms of concerns about redress and some of the treatment. So it's, you know, one appreciates from what you said. I mean, I think we've understood this, and it's true of the Japanese Canadian community and other Ukrainian Canadian where there's been internment. You know, it's an enormously disruptive experience within the community in terms of its relationships and identity, and that's you know, I think in many ways the greater difficulty and tragedy of you know, the terrors of history, if you like, or the tragedies of history that play out domestically in this case.
Yes. Well, I mean, in terms of internment, the Ukrainians were, because they were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I mean, of the, I think 7,500 internees in the First World War, I think over 6,000 were Ukrainians. And of course,
Yeah.
Alberta, because it was the hinterland, you know, I mean, you had Castle Mountain, Kananaskis, I mean,
Kananaskis, yeah.
yeah, I mean, you know, the internment camps there. In terms of the Japanese, of course, I mean, they were moved
Yes.
from the West Coast. Many of them were involved in the fisheries. And some of them, of course, ended up in southern Alberta, in the sugar beet fields, in Lethbridge. So you've got pockets of Japanese settlement in those areas dating back to the war. In terms of Italians, you know, the Japanese, I mean, property was expropriated, people were moved. In terms of Italians, there were only a few women, I think less than a dozen, who were interned. The rest were men. And certainly some did lose their property, because again, these are points, I mean, when you're negotiating redress. But in 1988, I was an official representative from Canada, chosen by the Italian consul Giovanni Bingoletto, based in Edmonton at that point, and I took part in the second Italian major conference on immigration. It had over 2,000 delegates from around the world. And I got to know the other Italians from the national congresses across the country, including the Federal National Congress. And that then, led by a lawyer, Anna Maria Castrilli, from Toronto, she was at the time on the board of the University of Toronto, and she eventually became the board chair. And so collectively, we worked on that paper that required an apology. I mean, there were no hard statements made about reparations. And so, as you know, it was at National Congress of Italian Canadian Conference in Toronto, at a reception outside Toronto, where Prime Minister Mulroney apologized. But because the apology did not take place in Parliament, it had no legal basis. Now, Prime Minister Martin did not want to deal with various ethnocultural communities with grievances. And so a fund was created to nurture development of educational materials. And so the Ontario's Italian community developed a grant application. I was part of that project, which created a virtual exhibit on Italian enemy alien designation and internment in the Second World War, and also a traveling physical exhibit. But there have been Italians who have wanted to see that apology in Parliament, and they do want to see some compensation. Now, the Prime Minister has indicated the apology in Parliament is happening this month. We'll see.
We'll see. So
yeah,
let's keep moving. We really have about 10 minutes left. So before we go into this next section, it's really our final section, and it's post-war, which again covers a broad period of history and development and experience in the community. A few more questions. So one from Gordon. After immigration, did the regionalism of Italy, and that he uses the term camponelismo, continue after immigration?
Absolutely.
Those affiliations, or did they band together more just for general support? I mean, I'm sure there was family links, and
I guess yes and no.
Yes and no. Yeah.
I mean, the division between North and South, which Wordsworth picked up, and I mean, and the image that he uses in the book in 1909 is the mafia, and so the Southerners, the dark, swarthy, I mean, were criminal. I mean, those are the stereotypes that you're dealing with, and the Northern Italians were more civilized and so on. And yes, all of that was brought to Canada. And I mean, and that you have those divisions where you have the larger Italian communities in Edmonton and Calgary. And that, Edmonton ended up with over 40 Italian societies, where that reflect those regional differences. Calgary, because it had a very well-established organization, which started out as one of the fraternal societies, the Calgary Lodge, it created the Calgary Italian Club, the Calgary Italian Society in the 50s. And so it remained dominant. After that, there were maybe 6 to 8 other organizations that formed. Whereas in Edmonton, you didn't have a unitary organization. You had all of this diversity of organizations based on region. So yes, they brought all of that. And that in terms of the oral histories, for example, Calgary oral histories, there are a bunch done by the Calgary Italian Club in the mid-80s. And of course, you see that playing out, that regionalism and division and so on in some of the oral histories. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move along really. So the third part of the book, and there's 4 chapters, really reflecting largely the post-war era. Strength in Numbers, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, Child Immigrants in the First Generation, Chapter 9, organizations and institutions, and then the last chapter, cultural identity and belonging. Maybe we can bring up the images again, Jessica. Thank you. And as I said, these really cover the post-war period to present and detail the strength, development, and growth of the Italian community in terms of institutional and organizational life, economic prosperity, which of course was also at play in the larger society in that period. Adriana, there's so much that happens. I guess of course we could just do a number of hours just on this. But of the many developments in the post-war period, what are the ones that are, for you, that are most telling or compelling in your view for the Italian community in Alberta, given your research and writing in this area? So I know there's a lot, but maybe you could pick a couple and just speak to that for a few minutes.
I think that, it's clear that Italians in that post-war wave of immigration went to Ontario and Quebec, and Vancouver. So those are, in terms of Italian communities. Toronto's Italian population makes it among one of the largest Italian cities. So the community is significant there. Why did they come to Alberta? Well, they came to Alberta because of the coming in of Leduc #1. Alberta was booming. And so there were plenty of jobs. And as I mentioned, you had the construction companies established here. And so that once they got through, working on the railways, because so many of them started like that, or working on a farm, that because for 6 months or a year, then you move to where you really wanted to be. And so they did come to Alberta, and certainly the two cities became really popular destinations, and you had growth of significant communities, and they found jobs everywhere. Initially, it was mainly laborers, but with trades. They were skilled carpenters, they were masons, shoemakers, all of this, so that they worked in these trades. But you also see women in the workforce. Of course, that's the Great West Garment Company. My mother worked there for many years. And of course, you're doing piecework, blue jeans. And she'd come home. She was allergic to the dye in the jean fabric. So her fingers would crack and bleed. Eventually she moved into the other, Tony Lynn and others, that it was women's apparel, which was a different kind of sewing. But Italian women worked in hospitals. They worked in, cleaning, cleaners for the government. You name it. So, and in my book, I've read in every era, I've focused attention and interest on women, because that their contributions are significant. And so I think that I would say the 50s and 60s, they worked, husband and wife worked. And in some families, as soon as the son turned 16, they went to work. Other families, they believed in the value of education, as mine did. And that generally speaking, they wanted education for their daughters as well as their sons. And so you saw the movement into the profession. So there's a huge number of Italian school teachers of that era. Moved into the law, into accounting, you name it.
Let's go to the next image, Jessica. I think we.
And then of course, you have the development of these services to the Italian community, which were really a harbinger of the popularity of all things Italian, in particular food. Frank Spinelli in the white overall in front of the Italian Center Shop, 1959. And that empire under his daughter Teresa, who's an incredible woman.
Yeah, for those not familiar with Edmonton, it's, you know, this is Edmonton icon.
Yeah.
Here, iconography, and a number of Italian center shops now established in the city.
And in the province.
In the province, yeah, pardon me.
The other thing that I would say is that, and that in particular in Edmonton, but also, you know, in Calgary and Lethbridge, the participation in multicultural activities. The Edmonton, you know, like, you know, the province, of course, set up culture and multiculturalism under MLA Horst Schmidt, and Italians were very much involved in that. And then the grants that were set up so that you really saw the communities flowering. And that when I then was recruited by Sabra Rancucci, who set up the Dante Alighieri Society in the late 60s and the Italian language school, he recruited me, and I immediately became president of the National Congress of Italian Canadians, 1986 to 1992. So I was involved in all of the meetings with provincial and federal government representatives, the introduction of these languages into the curriculum, the Northern Alberta and Southern Alberta Heritage Languages Association. I mean, and so, you know, people pioneered in Tony Falcone and you know, Tony Gotti and others. I mean, and their counterparts in Calgary. So they embraced all of this, and they really became models for other communities as to how to navigate in this strange world, right?
Yeah, yes, that's great. Maybe we can just move quickly through the next 2 slides, and there's a couple more questions. Maybe I'll actually speak to those quickly. We may not have time. I think we've got about really just less than 5 minutes left, so we can start wrapping it up. And thanks to everyone for your attention and hanging in there. One question I wanted to touch on, it really deals with some of the slides we're looking at. It's from Shan. This is the legacy of the immigration patterns in Alberta. So distribution of Italian Albertans today, you know, whether the descendants are largely from first generation Alberta immigrants to Alberta or from other provinces, you know, clusters of Italian communities. I mean, I'm sitting here in central McDougall, so I'm not far from Little Italy in the Boyle-Macaulay area, and the larger neighborhood, which was the Italian community, and then of course Bridgeland, Riverside in Calgary as well. So yeah, just can you comment on that? Any of the current distribution of the population from the in the community?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, that there were Italians in Alberta as early as you know, in 1883 when the CPR arrived in Calgary. I mean, there were Italians there, so the presence has been there for a long time. The major wave of immigration, as I mentioned, was post 1950s. And I mean, in some years you had 150,000, 160,000 coming a year. And that, of course, the, you know, Ontario, Quebec, Vancouver, and other parts of BC were at the top of that pecking order, but then a lot came to Alberta because of the economic growth of the province. So, I mean, in terms of the Italian community, you still, those people who came in the 50s as young men, I mean, they're all dying out. The Italian, of course, the Italian parish has been having multiple funerals for, you know, say for the last 7 or 8 years, and that generation is gone. So it's their children and grandchildren that now make up the Italian community. And the population of Alberta of Italian ancestry is probably in the 80,000 to 100,000, which is about 1.2% of the total population of Alberta. I mean, you have had some come in from other areas of Canada. I mean, no question about it. But I would say that predominantly it's still that immigrant community that has come through these eras of immigration.
All right. Maybe we can move through a few more slides and then we're really, or to wrap up, you mentioned the Dante Alighieri Society and Sab Roncucci, Calgary Italian School, and then you mentioned the Parish Life and Santa Maria Goretti, which would have been the community. I assume that was a parish established in the late 50s, early 60s here in Edmonton.
1958.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that was one of the first weddings that was celebrated.
Oh, all right. And next,
the Fogolar Furlan Italian Society float, that was in Calgary.
it's in Calgary, is it? So, yeah, part of the Stampede Parade, I assume. And then, of course, Edmonton Heritage Days, which is an enormous event here in Edmonton when we can gather, of course.
Yes.
And yeah, there's a few more here. We maybe just run the string, and I'll speak as we go. There's one more question I wanted to get to from Carly. I mean, it's a broader genealogy one, but recommendations or ideas you have on delving further into one's Italian family history in Italy. And this kind of touches, I mean, not, we were going to speak a bit if we had time on, archives and museums here. We're not going to have time. But Carly's asking about ways to get in touch with towns, access records and that. I don't know whether that's an offline discussion, but if you had a couple of comments there, that might be helpful, and where she could find some help.
I mean, the parish records. I mean, if you know where your family came from, write to the mayor of that town. And, I found that they're very responsive to this. They're fascinated by the immigration history of North America. And so I think that it's that right to the mayor. And I mean, every community has several churches. I would start with the mayor because it's the baptismal records. But also, of course, Italy is also digitizing its records. I mean, a good start clearly is ancestry.ca and ancestry.com, which allows you access to international collections. So that I would start with that. Canada is behind. I mean, we should, the Ellis Island records, you have to become a member, but you can find a great deal of information there. But I think that, Canada has to tackle digitizing its immigration records and its census records. I mean, I think there's nothing after 1920. And so that makes it very, very difficult.
Well, I think we will wrap it up, or at least still did some remarks. We're going to go back over to Rav in a minute, but Adriana, thanks so much. I mean, the book is remarkable. The title "Sojourners to Citizens" really captures in 3 words the scope of it, but it's really the richness of the tradition, experience, and memory that weaves it together that's exceptional. And so really, encourage people to get their hands on a copy. And if there's anything we can do here at the Edmonton Heritage Council to perhaps relay any further questions or comments to Adriana, although you'll find ways to certainly comment on the book online, I think. That would be wonderful. Anything you want to just say to wrap off, and then we'll go back to Rav and wrap up.
I'd like to say, since 1983, I've been involved as a volunteer in this. It's really social history, community history, local history, and that in 2015, I believe, was when the Edmonton Heritage Council asked me to do the to map the Italian community for the Edmonton community as museum project, right? And so I then went into my basement, opened up all of the boxes. I mean, some of the oral histories from 1983 and other stuff. And when I finished it, it dawned on me that if I dropped dead, all of this knowledge that I had gathered over the years and which was in my head would disappear with me, or my sons would send it to the dump. And so I had to write this book. And that, you know, so that for me, it's been a passion, and it's, you know, and I just feel so relieved and delighted to be able to tell these stories, because otherwise, I mean, Italians were a footnote in the building of the CPR, or, you know, I mean, you know, there wasn't any place that you could go to. And then I think what's important as well is that although the focus is Alberta, it's in a national and international context as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
and so that historiography is important.
Thanks for your commitment, Adriana. It's extraordinary, and it's really a model for work in any number of communities, but it's exceptional and exceptionally important for the Italian community. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to turn it back over to Rav to finish up, and thanks everyone for your attention and participation tonight.
Thank you, David. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for such a fascinating discussion, and thank you for all your questions and comments. Adriana, I'd like to thank you on behalf of our respective societies for portraying the Italian experience in Alberta in such an engaging context, and look forward to reading your book, and as well as look forward to your next book so we can do this all over again.
Well, and thank you to FRAMS, thank you to the Edmonton Heritage Council, thanks to you know, the National Congress of Italian Canadians Edmonton District, and Santa Maria Goretti Community Center, and all of those people in the Italian community who shared their stories with me.
Perfect. David, I'd like to thank you for doing such an excellent job moderating. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank Joe from the Edmonton Heritage Council and Jessica and Drew from FRAMS for working behind the scenes to make sure that this event went smoothly. I'd also like to thank the Consul General of Italy, His Excellency, Mr. Fabio Messineo, for his kind words and for joining us this evening. With that, I would bid everyone a good evening, and I'll just add the now standard pandemic farewell. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Buonanotte, everyone. Buonanotte.
Buonanotte. Arrivederci.
Good night, all.